Hello everybody, my name is John and I am a PHP developer at Sucuri. So as you can see behind me, this is my current office setup, and I love this kind of setup because it gets me close to nature. So you may hear some random birds and nature noise in the background. And at the same time, I do love work with technology, and this setup allows me to do that. I work with PHP, as I said, for Sucuri, and sorry. Even when I'm not working at work, I always on my computer. I love to participate, for example, in information security challenges or competitions. We have a team here in my hometown called Londrina Hacker Club. We do work in challenges for capture the flag competitions, and we play just for fun and just because we want to learn some new things. And my first experience with computers was when I was very young, still a child. But I started with programming in 1995 when I was 12 at the time. After that, I started working as a webmaster when webmaster was a thing. This word meant something actually in 2001. And with PHP, I first started working with PHP in 2003. At the time, it was PHP 3 or 4. So after that, I worked in a web agency with a lot of different code and different people with different backgrounds. So I got a lot of experience working with this kind of with different kind of codes and different styles. After that, I started in Sucuri in 2015, and it's funny when I first meet somebody new, and they ask me, "Oh, where do you work?" And I say, "I work for Sucuri. It's a great company. It's an American company." And they would say, "Wow, that's nice. And what do you do there?" And I say, "Well, I am a software engineer." And they would say, "Wow, that's cool. That's cool. And what language do you work for? Would you work with?" And I would say PHP, and they would probably say something like, "Oh, sorry about that." So I know that PHP has a bad reputation as a language, and I understand, but I still love the language anyway. And there are some reasons why PHP has a bad reputation. For example, when it first was created, it was meant to be used as a language to write a personal homepage. That is what PHP stood for in the beginning. But now with all the progress, all those development of the language, now it doesn't stand for that anymore. Now it stands for PHP Hypertext Preprocessor. And it's a great language. It's free, it's open source, it has a very active community, a lot of people to ask for if you need some help, if you need something. And it has a great performance, especially after PHP 7, because before that, a lot of people were complaining about the performance of PHP. And it's easy to learn. There's a lot of people that comes from PHP, for example, from C or C++ or Perl, because it's close to PHP, at least the syntax of the language. And there's a lot of people also that uses PHP as the first language to learn, to develop something, to program something. So there's a lot of newcomers. And PHP is multi-platform, so you can use, for example, in a lot of different web servers like Apache, Nginx, and you also can use PHP as a standalone program in your computer. So also it allows you to do a lot of things, to manipulate data, manipulate files, work with databases, a lot of things. And it's very malleable, so because it uses dynamic typing. And this is one reason why a lot of people start with PHP. Almost everything in PHP is an object or an array. So PHP is a language that is very, very used. There is a lot of people using PHP. According to some researchers, for example, more than 80% of the internet use PHP, or at least the first 1,000 websites from Alexa. So there is a lot of people using PHP, and it's still growing. But the problem is, with all those newcomers, a lot of people learn new things, and PHP having so many things and so different ways to do the same thing, you may end up with something like that. And what is that? It's a Swiss knife that has almost everything that you want, or even what you don't need. PHP has a lot of different ways to do the same thing, and sometimes you don't need to use everything. You just need, for example, a small knife. So you may get confused, and you may may even hurt yourself. So that's why a lot of people do clergies to make things work with PHP. And what are clergies? Well, clergies are also known as MacGyverism or improvisation, or something that is done without planning, or an alternative method, or a quick and dirty solution, or an alternative engineering, or a computer program that has been revised and tinkered with so much that it will never work. There is also a word for a programming paradigm called WOP, or workaround-oriented programming, that people joke about when you are doing a lot of clergies in your code. And clergy, as a slang term, can be a system, especially a computer system, that is constituted of poorly matched elements, or of elements that originally intended for other applications. So something that it was intended to do something, and you just rearrange it to make it fit in your code. And what are the kinds and causes of clergies? First of all, there is a lot of ways for you to add clergies in your code or in your work. It can be clergies in your code, can be clergies in your configuration, the way you are configuring your language or in your web server or whatever, or in your programming model, the way you are putting code, for example, the way you are developing something, or in the structure. For example, you could be using, files in a way that is clergy, creating a lot of files in the same folder. There's a lot of ways for you to make clergies. And what causes them? Usually is because of lack of experience. It's because somebody that is starting with the language or starting with the technology, or just because of lack of logic. So somebody that wasn't thinking very well on how to do something, or because of lack of methodology, because you are not using a methodology, or because of laziness. It happens. Sometimes you don't want to think. You just go with the flow and copy some codes that are working somewhere, and hoping that it's going to work where you are working right now. Or just because you are in a hurry. It happens sometimes when you get in a Friday at 5 p.m. and your boss is calling you and saying that you have to finish something and send something to production, and you have this hurry and you have to do something, and you do a clergy. Or because of legacy code. That happens when you have a code that is so old, with code that was meant to work in a way because you didn't have a right way to do something, and then it just gets the legacy. or because you're working with a Frankenstein code. For example, when there is a lot of developers working the same code, and they are using different methodologies and with different experience, and everybody working together and without a good coordination, you may end up with code that didn't work very well. Don't work very well. And so I have some examples of clergies with PHP. It's just a small sample because you can do almost every kind of clergies. There is a lot of ways for you to do something that is clergy. So I'm going to give you some examples. For example, this is the classic one, the things that usually when there is somebody that is starting with PHP or with a web language, they are using a form, for example, and they see that they have a lot of input fields, and they think with themselves, well, I don't want to check every field to record this in my database. I don't want to check if the name is correct, if the email is correct. I just want to record everything in the database. I don't want to write a huge code or something like that. So they do something like this. And what is this? It's a code that checks for all the fields, all the post data that comes from the user, and it just records the data in the database. It creates a string with all the data and records in the database. But the problem here is that you are not validating properly your code. And just to give an idea, with this kind of code, a hacker, for example, could make an injection in your database by the name of the field that you sent. So this is very unsafe. This is something that you should never do. You should always validate the data. It's almost like you are thinking, well, I don't have to think. You don't have to think if the code does everything for you. But your job as a developer is to think. And this is another one. This is something more common currently. There's a lot of people that are saying in the internet that when you are a good developer or a senior developer, you don't use else. Why should you use else? But they forget sometimes that you do have, or at least do something better. For example, in this case, there is a bug in PHP. It's not a bug, it's a feature that doesn't check for the kind of the variable, the type of the variable. So for example, in this case, we are checking if action is a string, right? But if the action is not a string, well, in this case, PHP is going to say that every if here is true. So if the user sends something like this, like an action that is an array, well, in this case, the hacker or the user would get all your HTML because, well, PHP is going to check that it's all the same. It's all valid. There is another one. This is very common also. For example, in this case, it's the user, instead of checking what the developer, instead of checking what the user can do, they are checking what the user cannot do. So it's a blacklist. So in this case, they are checking if the session is empty. But the problem is, in this case, if the session hadn't been initialized, well, the session would be null. And in this case, null is different from empty. So you should always check what the user can do and not what they cannot do. Also, this is something very common. It's not really a clergy thing. It's more like a problem that can create clergies. When you have a bad indentation or you don't have indentation in your code, and you have a lot of code, and all together, all with a lot of problems in the, it can cause a lot of problem, because if somebody tries to check this code and doesn't see where a if is starting, where a while is starting, they may get lost. And to make it work, they will just go with the flow, copy a code from some place and paste it here and go ahead. And this is very dangerous. There is another one. This is very common also. For example, in this case, the developer is checking, it's not using PHP functions to check for the list of files in the folder. What's the problem with that? PHP allows you to do that, because PHP, as I say, allows you to do almost everything in different ways. But it's not really protecting the inputs. In this case, it's just adding slashes to a string, for example, the directory or the folder. But sometimes you may forget that for web, you can have some characters are safe. For example, pipe or asterisk are safe. But when you are executing a shell code, well, this is not safe. So sometimes that happens, and you should be ready for that. And an attacker could, for example, with this, get the password files, for example, from your users, or your database could get that data file from your database. So this is very dangerous. It's almost like you are trying to protect your code, you are trying to protect your data, but you are trusting in the user, in the input from the user. So you have a chain, a big chain protecting your code, your data, but you have a small link made of plastic. This is another one. It's something not very common, but does happen. It's just an example. When, for example, the developer is doesn't want to check everything, doesn't just want to save the data and save a log. So in this case, they faked an exception with PHP. So what's the problem with that? Well, it's going to work. It's going to give the user the correct answer. But the problem is, in this case, it's probably going to mess with the syslogs. And if a sysadmin or even the developer wants to check the logs, they're going to check and see there is an exception, an error that say that everything is fine. The data was saved. It's crazy. So you can do that with PHP. Or even this one. This one is pretty common, actually. It's something, especially when you are starting to work with Autoloads or for an MVC or for a framework that you are building, something like that. You use this kind of function that is going to get the class from the URL or something like that. And the problem here is if the hacker knows about this and they try to get a file that is not PHP, there are some ways to bypass this and get this file and get all your data. So it shouldn't autoload everything. You should, for example, do a whitelist and make and sanitize your inputs and everything. You should never trust the user input, as I say. Well, so how to avoid clergies? First of all, use your head. So instead of just going with the flow, copying and pasting code without knowing exactly what you are going to do, no, think ahead, think well what you are doing. Don't rush yourself. Take your time to write your code. And sometimes when you have a very old code or a code that you don't understand very well, you should refactor this code, make it work, Or sometimes you even should rewrite your code if you don't know what it is doing. So sometimes you have to rewrite. And use the keys principle that is keep it simple and stupid. So instead of doing a big code with a lot of different kind of things that the code does, instead of this, you should make small functions, small methods that do simple and stupid things, because it's easier even to read the code. And use standards, because PHP has a lot of standards. It has standards for the indentation, how to make autoloads, how to standards for almost everything. And when you are following standards, it's much harder for you to make clergies. You still can do them, but it's your code at least will look easier to understand and to fix if something goes wrong. And use a CDN with cache to avoid direct access to your code. So instead of the user getting right to your code, right to your website, use a CDN that first caches your page, and the user gets the cached page, not the really PHP code. And be aware that attacks are unavoidable. Have backups and monitoring. That's very important. And use a WAF. And what is a WAF? A WAF is a web application firewall. And how a WAF can help you? Well, a WAF acts as an intermediary service between your website's application and the visitor reaching for it. So just like the CDN, it's going to avoid the direct access to your code, to your data. And it's going to intercept and remove malicious requests before they can cause damage. So if somebody sends a payload or a malicious input, it's going to get this, remove it, and send the request to your server. This way, it can help you keep your work, your server, your environment, and your customers safe. And just for an addendum here, most of the attacks happen because hackers are actively searching for huge amounts of websites for common vulnerabilities. So you may think, well, I have this small shop for, I don't know, for my town or whatever, and I don't think that the hackers are searching for me. They're not going to reach me. But what you should keep in mind is sometimes the hackers, they are not searching for you specifically. They are searching a huge amount of websites that they know, for example, using a web search or something, where they know that this is something that is vulnerable. So they search actively for this huge amount of files, and when they get the websites that are vulnerable, then they are going to try to attack. And sometimes it's even automatic. They are not really thinking, oh, this one is a good one. No, it's all automatic. And then WAF is especially effective if you do not have full control over your code. For example, if you are using plugins or code from other sources, for example, frameworks or common CMS, sometimes they get a 0-day vulnerability, and you don't have time to update and all those things, or you don't want to, you are insecure to update something and break stuff, or just because you prefer to do everything in-house. For example, you may not have all the experience for a team that is focused in security, and you just do your work there, and you are open your environment for hackers. Or just because you cannot or you don't want to upgrade your server or the language versions. For example, you may have a function that you need that is in PHP 5.4, and you cannot rewrite everything right now. You cannot refactor everything. So a WAF is going to know that you are using a version that is vulnerable and already have all the security measures to protect your server, to protect your data. And it's also effective if you use legacy code or you don't know very well the entire code. If you have a code that is from, for example, for an older version of PHP or another language, and it already has a vulnerability and you don't know about this, so a WAF is going to protect you. Or if you have sensitive data from yourself or from your users, and you may think that maybe, well, I don't have sensitive data because I don't record the credit card numbers or something like that. I only record the user's email and password. So for my dashboard or whatever. But you should never forget that a lot of users reuse the same password. So it's a pretty big chance that a lot of these passwords is the same for the users in their email or in their bank account or something like that. That happens a lot. And how much does this data, what's the value of this data for you and for your users? Also, a WAF cannot help you in some case. For example, it won't replace existing controls. You may not think that a WAF is a magic bullet, that just by installing a WAF you are protected and you should, for example, keep your server open or whatever. So no, a WAF is going to help a lot to protect your data, but it's going to complement the protection that you already have or you should already have. And a WAF won't rewrite your code, so it won't help you to write simpler code because it won't rewrite it, and won't help you to write less clergies if you are already writing some clergies. And I'm going to talk a little about the Sucuri Woth. It's a web application firewall and an intrusion prevention system that was specifically developed to address the challenge of site security. So it employs virtual patching and hardening technologies that mitigate attacks on your network without requiring the site owner to take any further actions. So if you have the Tsukuda Woth, you are going to protect your website, you're going to protect your data without needing to always get back and configuring stuff. After you first configure it, you don't have to go back all the time and checking everything and rechecking your everything, if everything is good or anything. I mean, so in this case, the Tsukuda Woth is going to have some analytic data that you can get, some reports that you can get, and is going to prevent a lot of different payloads and inputs, malicious inputs, and is going to help to protect your website. And how does it work? It works as a wall between the outside access and your server. So for the outside users or browsers or whatever to get your website, they will have to pass through the firewall, and the firewall is going to drop all malicious requests before they get to your website or your server. Well, a bonus here on how not to configure a WAF. First of all, not configuring it. So not pointing your website to the WAF. As I say, the WAF is going to be a wall between your users and your website. But you have to configure it So to make it pass it, or just by leaving loose ends. And what are loose ends? It's a partial configuration, for example. If you have a website that uses multiple domains to get to your website, and you just configure one of them and not all of them, or something like that, or just if you open your server, as I say, well, we're doing a partial configuration. And or, for example, as I say, the firewall, the Sucuri firewall allows you to whitelist and blacklist stuff. But sometimes you just want to have the WAF and whitelist everything. Well, you can do that. The firewall allows you to do that, but it's not a good idea, because if you are whitelisting everything, you are allowing everything. Or the opposite, blacklisting everything. That means blocking everything from the user, from all requests to get to our website. Or by whitelisting unsafe code. This is something that, well, you should not do. Well, basically, that's it. I want to say thanks. And that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Jean. Thanks, everyone, for watching. That's really a lot of information, a lot of good example, how-tos and how-not-tos. Actually, while you were presenting one of the later slides there, we got one of the questions coming in, which was actually answered in your slide. I will still repeat it just so anybody else who was listening can also hear it. Will a WAF rewrite vulnerable PHP code on the fly? So you already answered that. You will not do that. As I go on through some of the questions here, I will also post our survey for you guys. Please take a few seconds and vote your choice. Also, Jean, I will go on and ask a few questions for the time that we still have. Another question we got was, how do I know if the hackers are trying to invade or access my website?
Well, if you are using the Tsukuda Woth, you are probably going to have as I say, the reports part of the dashboard, where you can see what the users are accessing or trying to access. And we also have some tools for monitoring and for backups. So, for example, if you have somebody that is trying to drop your server or drop your website, we are probably going to monitor it and warn you about that.
Perfect. Another question here is, actually also uses the word perfect. Is there a perfect setup for my PHP code in order to prevent any attack?
Well, perfect, I don't know about that. I think that PHP has its flaws, but it's always improving. And also the security is always improving. For example, us at Sucuri, we didn't stand still and, well, this is our product and just go with this. No, we are always improving. But sometimes you get 0 days, and sometimes you have you may even don't know if you are doing something that it's unsafe, because it may be safe right now, but may not be in a few years. So I wouldn't say that a perfect solution is, but you can follow, for example, as I say, the PSRs, the PHP, the PHP standards, and you are probably going to be safer. But also, you never know. That's why you should always have security measures besides only trusting your code.
Yeah, exactly. And also talking about protection, there's another question here from Arjishti. I hope I pronounced the name correctly. Can a WAF protect forms from brute force attacks?
Yes, yes, yes. This is exactly something that a WAF is most effective, especially, for example, for MySQL or SQL injection, or even for brute force when you are trying to make a DDoS or something like that. WAF is perfect to protect that.
Great. Edward is also asking if he already has a CDN in place, does he still need a WAF?
Oh yeah, yeah, you do. Because a CDN, the way it works is usually by the first request will create the cache. So after the first request, you will get the HTML or whatever version of what you have. But a WAF is going to protect you since the first request. And a WAF also will protect you against, as I say, a DDoS or some other ways that could harm your data.
Another question here, can rookie PHP coding mistakes invite hackers inside my website files, even if I use htaccess blocking?
Well, if you are blocking, well, depending on how you configure it, for example, this is something that hackers do. It's called web shell. When they send a hooky PHP inside your code that allows them to request something. There are some ways to bypass this, because probably if you are executing PHP, you are allowing. You could, for example, blacklist everything and only whitelist one page per one file at a time. But at the same time, hacker could, knowing how your websites work or your applications working, they could request the PHP from inside another PHP and bypass your security by the ATSs.
Yeah. So there's not really much safety in there.
Yeah.
Please, if any one of you still needs to vote in our survey, please take a few seconds and do so. I will still leave it on a few seconds longer. I'm going to go to another question here, Jean. What is your advice on commenting PHP code? Any suggestions for best way to do it without leaving too much information out for hackers?
Commenting is not something very hackable, actually, because when you are writing the PHP code, when for example the web server is going to process the PHP using the PHP engine, they are probably going to strip your comment, and it's going to like compile. It's not compile, but it's almost like compiling your file and getting only the HTML. So if you do your comments inside PHP, they are probably going to be stripped before they get to your server. So only if you should not do your comments inside the HTML. So using the HTML tags.
Another question from Arjishti here. What is the best way or place to save database, third-party API keys, and tokens? If you can give an advice on that.
Yeah. The best ways depends on how you are doing your application. If you are doing an application with only one server, the best way should be out of your public folder with security measures for that folder. So you should never use, for example, the www or public HTML folders. Those are forbidden. You should never put sensitive data inside there. It should be only what has to have direct access by the users. But besides that, if you have if you can, you should use, for example, different servers that are only accessed behind your network. For example, you could use a server for your database, a server for something else, for your web application, and allow them only to communicate between them behind your local network. That would be the best.
Great. We'll take another one. Ali is asking if there's any suggestion from you regarding some sort of information that he can collect from website visitors that may help him or his webmaster to prevent or find if someone is trying to hack the website.
Yeah, actually, a WAF would do that for you, because WAF would have reports, should at least, with the Sucuri's WAF has a reports page inside the dashboard. But also there is some things that could help you. For example, checking your access logs and error logs from your server. If they are configured correctly, so they don't, your application doesn't have access and could never change them, and that's usually the most common. You could, for instance, check all your logs, but it's going to be a lot of logs probably. But you could check your logs and see if somebody is trying to hack you, and see. So you are basically monitoring your own application. It's going to be a lot of work and a really pain to check, and you have to know what is a bad request and what is not a bad request. And sometimes it's hard to understand. But well, that is something that you could help you, I guess.
Okay, one more, but really this is the last one we're going to take from Michael. He's asking if you know any good PHP code scanners that you like or that you can recommend or that you are using.
Well, actually there is one. Well, Sucuri has the SiteCheck. Is not a PHP. Actually, a PHP scanner is a scanner for your website. It's sitecheck.sucuri.net, I think. But I use one. I think it was Decoder. It was actually created by one of the founders of Sucuri, Daniel Cid. But it's not like like something that is even using something like that, you have to understand and know what is a bad request, what is a bad code actually, what is the code doing. There is not. I don't think there is a lot of good. I don't use something like that. So.
Yeah, well, if any other questions are coming our way, we will sure be gathering them and provide them to you, Jean, so you can answer everyone. Apparently, there's a lot of people asking questions, and especially very precise ones regarding codes. Our time is unfortunately over today. Thank you so much for participating, everyone. Thank you, Jean, for taking the time to spend and give us advice here. Everyone participating in the poll, thank you. For the people who asked if we are going to make this recording available, yes, we are. Everyone who registered will be getting, in a couple of days, you'll be getting an email. You'll have the video recording link in there. You'll also be getting the slides that John used during his presentation. And later on, the page will also list the questions and answers. And of course, we'll have a transcript just so everyone can access and read and enjoy. Thank you again for your time. Thank you, Jean.
Okay, thank you, everybody.